very warm welcome to Monsieur Julien Hertz, who is our guest for, oh gosh, the next 6 hours, I assume. No, I mean, our guest appearances are generally about an hour, but feel free to take as long as you like. Julien, welcome to the Mriya Report. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Jenny, for the very kind invitation, even if it took a bit of constitutional discussion to get us to this point. But thanks a lot. Huh?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, Julien, it's generally best practice to mute your mic when you're not speaking, because otherwise we get feedback on the space. So if we could observe that, that would be excellent. Could you please introduce yourself for our audience?
Yeah, of course. So, hi, everybody. So I have quite a mixed portfolio, but ultimately I am an expert in geopolitics from the French point of view and the European point of view. I'm an expert in EU politics, and having worked on campaigns in France and the UK since I was about 13, 14 years old, I think, helping out when I could. I'm a pretty big expert in European, on French and British politics. So thank you all for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've got loads to discuss because there's an awful lot happening in all of those areas. So we had a few topics we would like to cover, but I guess the hottest topic today is in fact the British general election, which contains a few surprises and a few not so surprises. So I think everybody has declared now. We have a stonking great majority for the Labour Party, over 400 seats. We have the Conservatives down to just over 100 seats. An interesting comeback from the Liberal Democrats with 60 odd. They have delivered their best results since the 1920s, if memory serves. And we've also got an outlier, a couple of seats picked up by the Brexit Party. The Reform Party, I say, as if that were a different thing. Now, the Reform Party, oddly, they have managed to get seats, which is very unusual for challenger parties in the Westminster system. And they also got almost 4 million votes. So they took an enormous amount away from the Conservative Party. It reminded me a bit of Lord Goldsmith's Referendum Party in the 1990s, really threatening the Tories from the right. Maybe lessons will be learned, who knows. Other news, the Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, now the largest Westminster party from Northern Ireland, and also the Scottish Nationalist Party have taken an absolute drubbing and are now down to, 10 seats, I think. So Sir Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And we had a little discussion earlier on about what that means for particularly Britain's relationship with Europe. But I would love to get your take on this, Julien. What are your impressions now the election has officially declared?
No, it's a really, really interesting election, honestly, not only for what it means for the UK, but also for what it means with the UK's relationship with the European Union, what it means for the UK's relationship with the USA, and probably more interestingly for your followers, what it also means for the level of support that the UK will be able to give to Ukraine, honestly. So, I mean, first of all, let's cover what happened. So, like you mentioned, Labour first place, Conservative second place, Reform picked up quite a few votes. They actually had more votes in total than the Lib Dems, just spread out across the country. And like you say, yeah, the Lib Dems are now the third biggest party with a big, big pro-European, pro-security platform. Labour went back to its Blairite era politics and is now running a very pro-European, very modern, progressive platform. But the most interesting thing is that the Conservatives basically drowned. I mean, let's put it this way. So, in terms of seats, the Conservatives have, I think, 1/3 of the number that Labour has, and only just under double what the Lib Dems have. And while Reform UK only had about 4 seats, sorry, the reality is actually very, very interesting when you look at the specifics here. So, despite the fact that Reform UK is pretty, let's say they're anti-globalist, they're anti-establishment. They have a lot of candidates, like in France with the RN who lean towards Russia. They still managed to pick up about 4,091,549 votes, which mostly came from the Conservatives, and which, if they had actually stayed with the Conservatives, which is my assumption, then the Conservatives would have actually probably had the most number of votes, if not the highest number of seats in this election. But the most important thing is, what does this actually mean? So, firstly, we now all have an actual partner in the UK. So we don't have a party that's basically being run on vibe politics and pointing at migrants and saying they're evil, or saying we should get people in to work the fields because nobody else wants to. We're going to have a government that's going to be positive, keen on being a big partner for the EU, keen on being a bigger partner for NATO, and someone who's going to want to actually engage with the European work being done on topics like Ukraine, which is very important because even though you had this image that the UK was very pro-Ukraine and it was very positive in general, which it was, let's be clear, the reality is that all of the big announcements that you guys heard when it came to Ukraine, they always came from off the back of a big scandal that was crippling Boris Johnson's polling numbers or Rishi Sunak's polling numbers. And you can go back and you can see every major announcement, there was always a huge scandal a day or two before. And you're not going to have to wait for this kind of impetus for Labour to engage. Because it's also not the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn. It's also not the Labour Party that was very close to Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France. This is a Labour Party that is very much more in the centre. It's much closer to the European positions, and it's going to be a lot more active.
Sure, and this is an interesting one, right? Both from a Ukraine perspective and a European UK relations perspective. Now, my take earlier on was that, okay, so we had in the Boris Johnson and Theresa May administrations, we had a very adversarial approach to the EU. And that was probably more adversarial under Boris Johnson than it was under Theresa May. However, we did get to the trade and cooperation agreement, which is, the closest bilateral relationship that the European Union has. Nevertheless, for countries that are as integrated as the UK and the European Union are, it's not really adequate, right? It's from a from a kind of a raw trade perspective, and also the mechanisms it creates, they'll do for now, but they're really foundations to build on, rather than the final the final settlement between the two. And I kind of agree with you that with a Labour government, we're going to, it's kind of a fresh start, right? I mean, Rishi Sunak was a fresh start to an extent, but this is a new party. It doesn't have the same political baggage as the Tories. And so, there could be a new era of better cooperation, and a softening of relations between the two parties, right, Julia?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, we have to also take the that agreement into context. So if you look at what actually happened, the Brexit negotiations were hard, and they were much harder than needed to be in the first place because of the fact that the UK was constantly playing to its domestic audience with messaging towards the EU. And this made everything incredibly difficult because you had politicians and the Brexit secretaries and the conservative leaders constantly aiming their political weapons at the EU and saying, these people are evil, they want to destroy you, we're going to do whatever we want, they can't stop us. Which is why we ended up finding these trade agreements that were very, very weak because the fact, or no, let's not say weak, but let's say problematic. Because the fact that the EU simply couldn't trust the UK to behave like a strong actor. I mean, for example, one of the big examples was the fact that border checks on goods coming into the UK weren't actually being enforced until I think very recently, if they even are being enforced now, because the UK physically wasn't able to do it without crippling its economy. And this is why you had lots of these things like the border checks between Northern Ireland and the UK and all of these issues constantly being brought up because quite simply the EU didn't trust the UK. And this is something that's very important when it comes to international politics. And this is where, for example, as many of you know, there's been a huge effort to keep relationships strong between the EU, the West in general, and Ukraine. Because if you don't have that trust between partners, you can't work, and you can't really do something that's open. You can't be strategic. You can't be tactical. You have to be defensive. And actually, just because I received a question from one of the people in this chat, just to come back to the UK topic before we get sidetracked by Ukraine, which I feel like we're going to at some point. I had a comment on a question on the Sinn Féin win in the Northern Ireland and whether it's going to help with the full implementation of the Windsor framework, etc., etc. Now, there is an issue on this topic where basically, again, it depends entirely on how the UK government behaves. Now, I think that it will help. So the Windsor framework is what governs the passage of goods between the UK and Northern Ireland. And what effectively it is dependent on is the Labour government being a strong partner and the EU recognizing that and everybody coming forward to work better together. And I think that it will have an impact that is positive. And the Irish Republic, I mean, not Northern Ireland, they have a strong interest in actually making this work because Northern Ireland doing well, especially when it's run by more Republican parties like Sinn Féin, will allow the EU and the Republic of Ireland to actually have a strong relationship with Northern Ireland, which helps Republican positions. It helps with the relationship with the UK because it makes the UK feel more included and more integrated into European structure. And in general, it's better for everybody because more trade, as everybody knows, is usually good for people. So I don't know how to Declan White. I don't know how to say your name in Gaelic, but yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Julien. Yeah, I mean, the Northern Ireland is always going to be a tricky one, right? Because it's essentially an attempt to forge a forge a forge an accommodation between two completely exclusive positions, right? So, and one of the issues is that the both of the positions are kind of equally valid, right? And it's got added complications on top. So there is the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom, right, which is kind of civilizationally fundamental. And then there is the European Union's right to protect her market. And I think what we saw was the two sides driven towards harder and harder lines. And I think when it comes to Northern Ireland, I think there is blame on both sides, right? So there is the insistence from the European side of a kind of a kind of very strict binary. You are either you are either you either have this status or you have that status, and there's no spectrum for accommodation in between those things. And from the UK side, it was like, well, we are either territorially integral or we're not. And neither side succeeded in really creating a happy medium that satisfied everybody. And so the whole thing turned into a bit of a dog's breakfast. I mean, to give specific examples, right? Do we really think that the possibility that British products might cross the border into Ireland is a threat to the single market, right? And I ask this because there was a comment from an unnamed European official about this, and he used the example of olive oil. Now, I'm I'm no agronomist, but I don't think Lancashire produces very much olive oil, and so it got it all got a little bit silly, and the lines got harder and harder and harder. And I think with this reset, we could see a more kind of a more pragmatic approach where it's recognized that both sides will, like, neither side of this will have it perfectly, right, Julia?
Yes, and I mean, again, we need to really keep hammering home that this is effectively a reset. But to come back to what you were saying, so there's a lot of really interesting things that happened around the discussions with, for example, the damage that things could do to the single market. So, for example, your point on olive oil. If I remember correctly, and to be fair, it has been a little while since I worked on the whole post-Brexit trade situation with the EU. There was the big issue where effectively you had a lot of conservatives and pro-Brexit people who were saying, well, if we can't, if we're being impacted by Brexit because, and they always framed it as the EU being really mean to the UK and trying to punish them, which unfortunately, sure, there was a punishment for Brexit, but it was just a natural reaction of the trade situation and leaving the single market. There was a lot of things where there were people suggesting that, for example, maybe what British sellers would do is they would buy olive oil from outside of the EU, repackage it as a British product, and then sell it in the single market to sort of make up the shortfall when it came to these things. Or, for example, there were things on American beef and American livestock and chicken being used to create products, despite the fact that they didn't necessarily meet the sanitary and the scientific requirements of the EU single market, and then selling these in the EU, which would effectively be illegal. And this is why you saw the EU taking a really aggressive position on trade, because ultimately there were big fears on a severe drop in quality when it came to the products actually being sold in the EU. And this is one of the things that you don't necessarily always hear about, honestly, because firstly, trade is very complex. It's very, very complex. And then when you also then add in the topics of sanitation, the quality of the food, etc., it gets even more bombastically crazy. And this is why, with the single market being basically the jewel in the crown of the EU, why the EU was being so tough when it came to actually dealing with the UK. And again, this is where the big reset comes through, is once you have a government that's seen as responsible, that actually takes its responsibilities correctly, that doesn't do what the UK, what the Conservatives did, which was basically try to deregulate as aggressively and as fast as possible. And I'm noting here, for example, the laws on waste being gotten rid of, where the Conservatives basically said, you know what, you can just dump them into waterways. Which is why since 2022 there is a map that shows what beaches in the UK have the most fecal matter in the water, you know? And
Well,
this is going
that's
to be quite. Go on. Go ahead, Tim. Go ahead. Or I can continue. I mean, so there's
oh,
these kind of. No, go ahead, Tim, please.
I was talking. Oh,
Yeah, you muted yourself, I'm afraid.
Are you having audio issues, Tim?
I think he may
Yep.
be.
Yeah, he did have audio issues.
Okay. And just to check, no one's having audio issues with me. Are they? Can you guys hear me correctly?
Yes. No, you're
Perfect.
coming in perfectly clear.
Nickel, c'est super. But yeah, so just while Tim maybe tries to resolve his issues with the audio. So this is why you had, for example, a lot of the this focus on a lot of the sanitary issues in the UK. So, for example, and this isn't me being hyperbolic, to be honest, because it was a big impact with EU waterways around the coast as well. There was a lot of fecal matter that was being pumped out by water treatment agencies, like I think Thames Water or something, where they basically ended up because they were deregulated, they didn't need to treat the water as much, so they just pumped it out into the ocean and into the rivers and the waterways and everything, which led to a spike in things like E. coli. Which again, this is why having a Labour Party that has indicated and shown that is very much pro science, not necessarily pro-regulation, even though socialists tend to be, but very much pro doing the right thing, actually regulating to make sure people are healthy, is very important, to be honest. So, yeah. Tim, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, sorry. There's a bit of mythology around the water quality thing. What actually happened was the UK simply got better at measuring a problem that was already there. So there was the appearance of the water quality decreasing, but what actually was happening was a more effective measurement of the water quality as it stood, and that was due to the British implementation of the European water quality regulations of 2018, because we were still in the European Union in 2018. So there's kind of a bit of mythology around the deregulation, and I think this was part of the issue, right? And this was part of the reason that the European Union line hardened quite a lot vis-a-vis the UK, is because what the European Union were doing was they were interpreting rhetoric as action, right? So there was a big rhetorical tendency, a deregulating rhetorical tendency within the Conservative Party that was very, very, very loud, but didn't actually do anything. So, and what, how Brussels interpreted that was like immediate precautionary principle, right? If these guys are going to turn the UK into Singapore upon Thames, then, or Singapore in the North Sea, whatever you want to call it, then we have to have a precautionary approach to what they might actually do, because that might become a threat to the single market. To which the British objection, and this is absolutely, I think, a valid objection, would be, well, none of this stuff has actually happened yet. You're basically going to interrupt long-standing trade on the basis of something that hasn't even been adopted as any party's policy, let alone a legislative proposal, let alone an actual change in regulation.
No, but just to
Yeah.
come in on that point, this has actually happened. So I think the environment law was adopted at some point in the environment bill, sorry, was adopted sometime in 2021, and since then, I mean, I'm just looking at an article here in the BBC from 14th of June this year. It's saying that pretty much every English water company basically doubled the amount of raw sewage they discharge into rivers and seas around the UK in 2023 alone. Apologies. So this is something that has happened. And I know that there was the fear initially, but this is why the UK keeps getting into trouble with the EU. Well, not into trouble because they're not a kid, but and this is why it became quite a big thing in this election, for example, when it came to the health and the water treatment thing.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that. I'm having coast connection issues at the moment, so I just have to go and have a look at that. Bear with me 1 second, please.
No worries.
Oh dear. I have no intelligent questions to ask, unfortunately.
There are no dumb
I
questions. I fully
actually,
subscribe to that. Huh?
actually, there are.
Okay.
Uh, I've never been interested in politics, and I got into geopolitics like 2 years ago. I
You
am
did
not,
the right thing. You did exactly the right thing.
and I only got into it because of Russia's war in Ukraine, and I could see the connectors, and then
Yeah.
I'm like, huh, this is interesting. And so I find geopolitics a lot more interesting than, for example, the politics of my own country, Sweden. I'm just like,
Swedish
now,
politics can be quite interesting as well, to be fair, no?
really?
Yeah, it's there's lots of interesting dynamics when it comes to a lot of the defense topics and a lot of the. Well, I mean, it's not interesting in an actual interesting way, more in a morbid way. The immigration discussion around Sweden, for example.
I guess I just like really. I have never really bothered. I'm like, I barely keep track of who is our prime minister. I know general party that's in charge, and then that I'm like, this is good enough. Uh, that has been my policy for as long as I can remember. But then with the geopolitics, I find that a lot more interesting when you can see how the different countries are working together or working against each other. And when it comes to UK politics, I don't know enough. I
I mean,
really don't.
honestly, it's not necessary because people, and I mean, this is very much a general topic that this is a thing that I talk about quite often when it comes to the political sphere, side of things, because people always say, they don't know enough, or they're not interested enough, or they don't understand how to get interested in the topic. Honestly, what you've done is exactly what people should do. So, I mean, you found something that interests you, which is geopolitics. You've decided that this is the topic that you want to cover, this is what you want to go from. But for example, as a geopolitician myself, the reality is that everything that happens at the domestic level feeds up to the geopolitical level. So the international arena, when it comes to defense, security, diplomacy, whatever, everything goes up. And this goes back to what me and Tim was saying earlier, is that the UK election, for example, is a great reset because it's effectively allows the UK to sort of recover from a few, like a decade or so of chaotic conservative rule, to re-establish standards and other things domestically, and by doing so, it becomes a stronger partner pardon me, for the EU, who wants to have a partner that isn't always at odds with it and isn't fighting with it all the time.
So, do you think that the UK will ever join the EU again, or do you think that they will just kind of be on the outside and being a partner?
I mean, it's a very interesting question because it depends on so many things that I think not even quote unquote geniuses like Dominic Cummings would be able to give us a good idea, right? But the reality is, for example, that the UK, it's in its interest to be part of the EU, quite simply. But it depends entirely on how the political situation domestically evolves, how the situation evolves in the EU. So, for example, as a European federalist myself, how would the UK feel if, for example, in a couple of years, so you'll have had all the current candidates joined, you'll have Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, maybe Albania, you'll have a full European Union in effect. And what that could have an impact on the UK position in terms of its total vote share and how much say it would have, This is something where a lot of these countries, like the UK, it's big complaints was we're not as powerful as we want to be in the EU. People don't do what we tell them to do. And this was the thing that Nigel Farage was constantly pumping out and saying, look, we have no power, we can't do anything, etc., etc. And this is something that if there's more members and the parliament is bigger and the council is bigger and the commission is bigger, that may be something that could be said and felt more acutely. But I think, and I have stood by this for since about 2017 now, I think that I thought that the UK would rejoin the EU within 30 years. I would maybe expand that to 40 years now, but to be honest, I think it will join eventually. I don't see the value in not joining, personally myself, because of how volatile the US is, because of the dangers of Russia and China, and because the simple fact that the EU have told the UK, look, rejoin when you want. You're not going to have the opt-outs and all of this kind of thing, but you will still be there. I mean, we will still be there and you'll join. But it also depends on if the EU still exists in 30 years, which is another issue.
Thank
Oh,
you. Thank you very much for that. Just want to apologize. I'm having absolute tech nightmares here. I keep bouncing up and down. I keep losing my mute button. So I do apologize. I just wanted to jump in on that topic, if you don't mind, Jenny. I think you make an important point, right? It depends whether the EU still exists, and I'm not one of these people who believes that, I'm not the Daily Express, right? Believing that the EU is constantly on the verge of collapse. But I think I think a better way to frame that question would be the UK might join the EU in a number of decades, depending on which form the EU takes in the future, right? Because it seems very clear to me that the Treaty of Lisbon is an inadequate formulation for achieving what Europe could achieve. And it seems to me that the federalization of the kind of Carolingian core of the EU. So by that I would say Germany, the Benelux, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy. Um, that would seem to be a very that would seem to be the only rational way forward for Europe, and this would of course leave some members in the dust. So there would be a need for, Javier Solana's dreaded two-speed Europe. There would be a need for a looser association around the edge, probably including the UK as well. I mean, I know you're a promoter of European integration and European evolution. I'd be good to know your thoughts on that, Julian.
No, yeah, and I mean, to be honest, this is the case really, because it is really one of those things where we have to see how the EU is going to evolve. I mean, as you say, Lisbon was good for its time. Lisbon brought us forward, it pushed us forward, it helped us develop the EU that we know today. It was beneficial to Europe, but it didn't go all the way. And the question is, again, so for example, to all of your listeners, this is something it's very, for example, what kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a more federal series of states a la USA or Germany? Do we want a more presidential united Europe that is more along the lines of countries like France, for example? Do we want a semi-parliamentary states, well, semi-parliamentary, a parliamentary European Union along the lines of the UK? I mean, where do we want to go with this? How do we want to go? Which is the first question. And this is going to impact how a lot of, like, the UK joining will happen. Then again, you have the question of, okay, say we end up with a European Republic, for example, where we have a parliament with probably at some stage like 1,500 MPs, or you have then a Senate underneath that, and then potentially the president of the Commission, Council, whatever, at the top. How would the UK, a country that doesn't necessarily really deal with this kind of political system, feel about joining something that looks like that? You know? And on top of that, how would member states or another state feel about how this could look where, for example, the current member states become federal entities? And I hold the belief that the EU would not actually erase the national identities of the member states, but would actually just form them into political entities along the lines of, Alabama, New York, whatever. And then becoming subsumed in the views of some ways in this great entity. And this is something that there's a lot of questions that you need to ask yourselves, especially just as Europeans within the member states and within the EU, or as candidate states like Ukraine is, or as a potential member state in the future, or a likely member state in the future like the UK. And this is something that's quite an interesting discussion to have, and it's a discussion that we have quite often here in Brussels and in the political circles. And one way of going about this, as you said, Tim, was going around this two-speed or three-speed or four-speed Europe idea that's been floating around for a long time. And this is very interesting in itself because it's something that started popping up again under the Macron presidency. So very recently, he launched the European Political Community, which was almost intended to be the outside circle of the EU. And this is something that was sort of formed to combine with, the European neighborhood and all of these kind of instruments that are used to maintain the relationships between the EU and its neighbors. But then you have the question, how would you go about a multi-speed Europe inside of the European Union right now? So for example, what would you have? Would you have the original states like Italy, Spain, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany all forming a core where they're basically indistinguishable from one another? That's quite a tough ask because, for example, just taking the question of strategic autonomy, or actually, no, I'll take something that makes a little more sense to your readers, or to your listeners, sorry. The question on Russia. Already in that segment, so those original member states, you have three different positions. You have the block Russia at all costs position, you have the keep them at arm's length but work with them, and then you have the position of, well, we can hope that they're going to get rid of Putin, so we'll work with them and continue over, already something that's quite consequential as it is, but isn't necessarily existential for the way the EU functions. You have three positions that are fairly irreconcilable because of various economic, socioeconomic, and let's say geopolitical positions. Now, take something like, let's say, the CMU. I always forget what the actual title is, but
The customs union.
not the customs union, but it's the capital markets union. Sorry, something like this, which is used to basically centralize the ability to build a single market for capital, to put forward a proper framework for people to be able to actually, let's say, invest more effectively in a European market rather than having to choose to invest in, for example, Germany, Italy, France, Ireland, what have you. This kind of thing is a complex and very, very, very fighty topic between the member states. Because the fact that some member states simply have more ability to raise capital to be able to actually get people investing or to be able to build markets and all of this kind of thing. Which is why we have the whole government subsidies, regulations, and the blocks on giving people too many things to do, or too much power economically competitive as member states. Because otherwise, there's a fear that the single market becomes distorted, and you have a member state like France or Germany or Spain that dominates the entire market, for example. And these all play into this topic of, for example, this multi-speed Europe, because by its essence, you would find the European Union where you'd have a central bloc that would dominate everything, whereas slightly weaker member states, such as Bulgaria or Greece or something, would actually find themselves in trouble, which is difficult.
I mean, I would argue that we kind of have that already, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, but I think it would get worse if you actually ended up going too far into the way of the development of this multi-speed Europe. But also, we then have to ask ourselves the question: is this the necessary evil? Because you know that when countries join the EU, they usually take an immediate hit because of the fact that they then have to compete on a bigger market with bigger actors who also want access to their markets. Which is why we have the phased integration system for countries like Ukraine, especially with the current situation now, so that Ukraine finds itself able to actually have effective competitive actors when it eventually joins the single market. Because the EU, while people talk about it as a globalist, capitalist hellhole that's equal only to some kind of demented cyberpunk universe, you basically have a system that's intended to protect people who are member states that are weaker. And we sort of need to strike the balance between pushing forward and driving forward to this great European dream and this great European project, and also making sure that we don't leave people behind. Because we cannot, and okay, I'm putting on my social liberal hat on right now, but we cannot develop the EU that leaves European citizens behind in the dust. To give a very long answer to that question, Tim.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I understand that it's not a simple issue, but I think a lot of it is like one of the things I complain about on Mriya Report quite a lot is a kind of lack of political salesmanship. So there seems to be a collective failure on the part of not just European, but I would argue Western politicians to grapple with difficult ideas and sell them to the populace, right? Because we're democracies, sure, but our democratically elected leaders are just that, right? They're leaders. Part of their job is to we it's a symbiotic relationship between the two, right? We give them ideological guidance through our vote, but they are the ones that have to come up with and sell the grand ideas of what is ultimately in our civilizational interest. And I think one of the things that the European Union is particularly bad at is selling those ideas to the public. And I appreciate it's not easy, right? Because the EU structures are kind of in a double bind, right? Because if they don't sell ideas to the public, they're seen as remote and out of touch. If they do, then they're seen as propagandizing. Uh, so there's always a cynical tendency that will, that will damn them either way. But I think what we do need to see, particularly from the EU, particularly from national politicians, is a greater willingness to say, look, here are the challenges we face civilizationally. Here are the existential problems we have, not just as countries, but as the European Union. Here are the options for dealing with them. We feel that this is the best one. These are the reasons why, and kind of have that kind of degree of engagement, and above all, that degree of salesmanship towards the people, even if the idea itself is not kind of immediately popular, right, Julien?
No, I fully agree. And I mean, in a second, we'll get to one of the people who have done this the most recently, which would be Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. But I mean, this is why it's so important that we have experts in the public sphere, experts on great shows like the Mriya Report, and experts across the internet who are actively making the case every single day. Because to be honest, I mean, for example, around Brexit, so I'm from a small town in the south of the UK called Croydon, just south of London. And
You have my sympathies.
listen, it made me a stronger man, and to be honest, I cannot complain. But it's one of these things where, for example, people there, so, I'm fully admit that the schools there aren't great. Like, I went to the worst school in the UK, quite frankly. And to be entirely honest, most of my work around Brexit was actually basically speaking to people around Croydon, speaking to people in my mum's network, the people who she helped out at the local schools when that we went to when we were kids, all this kind of thing, and helping them to understand how the EU functioned and why the EU was important, because people hadn't done that, and they don't have civic education in the UK, quite honestly. I mean, my favorite point was, I think it was some old dodgy conservative MP who basically stood up in the parliament and said, "Oh, guys, guess what? What's going to happen is that in 2021, the Lisbon Treaty will be completed." And I was just sat there like, what the fuck are you talking about? And then he says, and then all of the member states of the EU are going to have to dissolve their armies and form them into a cohesive European military force. Now, all of you are probably listening to this and going, what the hell are they smoking over there? And to be honest, nobody has a clue. But the fact that the Lisbon Treaty was pretty much done by, like, I think, early 2008, and the fact that I don't think a single member state would willingly just dissolve its military all of a sudden just to lose all power, it made zero sense. But I had to spend weeks of my hopefully very long life telling people that it was complete nonsense and that the Lisbon Treaty was pretty much done and dusted. I mean, it was pretty much concretely finished. But again, this comes down to the fact that, and this is my bugbear across all politics, we need better education across Europe. And I mean, to be honest, we need better education everywhere. But I mean, I'm European, I focus on Europe. You guys are my people, and I'd rather you guys have a better education than Americans, to be quite honest, even though if it would help if they did have better education. But we need to have better education on the EU and civics here in the EU. We need to have a better explanation of how the EU functions, and we need to get better at promoting the kinds of people who can make the EU easy to understand for the people who need to understand and who vote every 5 years in the European elections. And this is why presidents like Emmanuel Macron are quite helpful in several ways. But we can get to that in a second when we get to the French side.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think this is one of the areas where I'm actually quite jealous of the American education system, right? Because the American education system, at least at the high school level, creates really good Americans, right? I'm always astonished. Like we have, we have a very large American audience and a lot of Americans in our co-hosting team. I'm always astonished by like the average level of political knowledge of the American, right? Because like the degree to which they understand their own political system is just quite extraordinary, and you don't see that in Europe. And this is because in the American education system, they have this really, really strong focus on civics, even at the expense of kind of more detailed subject teaching in, I don't know, English literature or maths or whatever. So there are some that argue that it possibly goes the other way. It possibly goes too far that way in the United States. But nevertheless, there is a balance to be struck, right? And I do agree that civics teaching, particularly in the UK, is pretty abysmal. Okay, so perhaps it would be a good moment to pivot. Two ways we could go from here. We could either finish off the European Union by talking about Hungary and the presidency of the Council, or we could pivot to France. I'll leave it to you, Julia. What do you want to do?
I mean, let's go for let's switch to the Hungarian presidency right now, because there's something quite interesting for your readers, for your listeners, sorry, I keep saying readers, but for your listeners, that could be quite interesting on the fact that Viktor Orban has basically gone completely rogue, and he is trying to single-handedly negotiate with Russia how to end the war in Ukraine. So,
Okay, so
yeah.
let's start from first principles. I have explained exactly what. Well, I have explained exactly what I think the Hungarian presidency of the council means. But perhaps it would be best for you, an actual expert, to explain that to the audience.
So, I mean, thank you very much for the kind words, to be honest. But and it's always nice to be able to explain this to people, because the EU is quite complicated. So, I mean, you guys all know the European Commission, you know the European Parliament, but the one that confuses everybody is the Council. So, effectively, you can put it in the easiest way that I've found of explaining it is that the European Council can effectively be split into two. So, you have the European Council, which is where the heads of states, and meaning the presidents, the prime ministers, and everything, come together to discuss the key points of the European Union, how to develop, how to move forward, and they vote on important things. But this is also combined with the work of the Council of the European Union. And this is why it's complex, is because, so alongside the European Council, which is the heads of states, all of the national ministers for the various ministries all meet in various configurations in the council. And this is where they make decisions on, for example, having a discussion on, let's say, so say there is a topic like Ukraine, they're discussing the funding for Ukraine. What the member states will do is they'll have the Foreign Affairs Council meet, discuss the points, take it back to the member states, and then work with the member states configurations and the permanent representations to the EU to construct a position that could then be voted on at the European Council. And this is where the rotating presidency comes in, where every 6 months, 6 months? Yeah, every 6 months you have a member state who takes over in 18-month rotations. So you always have blocks of 3 member states that work together to create a big program on how to drive the work of the EU forward. But this position is effectively a coordinator. It is not the president of the EU. It is not the president of the council, of either council for that matter. It is purely the member states as part of a rotating trio who ends up taking over effectively the administrative and the coordinating work at the European Council level. And currently that is Hungary. And like usual, the position of the title completely went to Viktor Orban's head. But I guess you have some questions on this, Tim, and I don't know how deep you went into this earlier.
Yeah, that's okay. So my understanding and explanation was broadly correct. The way I've been framing, because I agree, right? The press is particularly bad at this, right? Because they say, oh, Hungary is now president of the EU. It's like, well, no, that's not how it works. The way I've explained this is basically the council, as that is the Council of Ministers, is a legislature. So it's sort of a Senate. And Hungary's presidency of it means that Hungary basically gets to be Mike Johnson for 6 months and gets to control the legislative agenda. Is that a correct explanation?
Yeah, effectively. I mean, it's basically the Council of the EU is basically the co-legislator to the Parliament, and they help them to write European laws. And then basically the Council presidency basically helps them to coordinate and make sure that it drives their agenda forward. So yeah, basically.
Okay, fantastic. So the Hungarian presidency of the Council. Let's talk about that. I understand that the president, the country that's presiding, generally has a theme for their 6 months. They have a published list of priorities. Hungary's is what was it? Make Europe Great Again,
Yeah,
which
mega.
is mega, which is well, that's an interesting one. So I've heard various complaints from our friends in Brussels um, about the way they see this progressing. What's the expert scoop? What do we anticipate happening for the next 6 months?
So it's to put it, so yeah, 6 months, and to put what we're expecting into context. It's been 5 days, and we've already had, I think, two diplomatic incidences, where you now have Viktor Orban, who's gone rogue, and he's trying to single-handedly negotiate a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia with literally no authority whatsoever, and pretty much the entire European ecosystem is reminding him that this is the case. And on top of that, you also have the fact that he's apparently, from what I have heard very recently, he's apparently already made some overtures to Donald Trump to invite him to a future European Council meeting without him being elected or without anything happening. So you can already see that this is going to be a very interesting, fighty kind of presidency. But ultimately, because of the fact that it is guided by very strict regulations and because there are three countries in the trio, what is effectively happening is that Hungary is going to be limited, and like usual, Viktor Orban is going to make a lot of noise. But I think the biggest thing that he could have stopped was potentially the confirmation of the candidacies of future member states, and he failed to do that. So what we're going to have is we're likely going to have 6 months of the Hungarian presidency basically making a lot of noise through Viktor Orban trying to make friends with his friend Vladimir Putin and prove his worth, but also finalizing a lot of the work that wasn't finished by the previous and what a predecessing Belgian presidency, which had, quite frankly, an amazing 6 months where they got through a lot of work. But to put it into context, they have 7 thematic areas for this presidency, which is enhancing EU competitiveness, reinforcing defense policy, rendering enlargement policy more consistent, stemming illegal migration, shaping the future of cohesion policy, which is probably just exactly what you've got coming to mind, promoting a farmer-oriented EU agricultural policy because the right likes working with farmers, and addressing demographic challenges. And this is something that is quite interesting because ultimately, if people wanted to stop pretty much every single thing that Hungary wanted to do on these points, they could. The parliament could spend the whole time dragging their feet. The commission could do the same. The council could basically just trip or Hungary up all the time. They won't because it's not constructive, but they could. And Hungary has been made slightly weaker in what they could have potentially done that could have been disruptive, purely because of the fact that in Brussels right now, it is a formation period this month for the parliament, so everybody's trying to figure out what's happening. The commission is being formed until sometime in November, October, which is maybe even December, which is going to put a halt to a lot of the work that could be done. And on top of that, most of Brussels goes on holiday between July and September and October. What am I talking about? July and August, which means that the work that Hungary could do is severely limited purely based on the fact that there's not actually much going on right now. And the legislative work is going to pick back up again in September. So really, rather than the 6 month presidency, you're going to have a Hungarian presidency that's about, realistically, about 4 months of actual work, as opposed to being 6 months of carnage, which limits a lot of the damage that could be done, quite honestly. But it's still going to be quite tough. And it's still going to be also reliant on a lot of what happens with, for example, the upcoming parliament, what's still on the table from the last mandate, and a lot of these things. So ultimately, the press is doing a relatively good job of actually holding Hungary's feet to the fire and making sure that people understand how ridiculous the behavior is. But the damage is going to be, if there is any, quite short-lived and very reduced, purely because the fact that ultimately the Hungarian presidency doesn't have a lot of power and doesn't have a lot of allies and is limited by the legislative procedure right now, ultimately.
Fair enough. So one of the things that was concerned about our listeners, right, is we all know who Viktor Orban is. He's a man we all know and hate. The impact this could have on the European Union's ability to support Ukraine is pretty minimal to non-existent, right?
Ultimately, I mean, there was an attempt that was blocked a few months back when it came to sanctions, and I believe there was another impact that was blocked when it came to providing financial support to Ukraine. But if I remember correctly, the member states basically just went around Hungary and did it outside of the council as quote unquote independent member states, just doing it together as if they were the council anyway. And a lot of what's happened now is that Hungary is also having to try to show that they're responsible. And to be honest, I could see Hungary having quite a lot of trouble blocking anything right now because it would just make them look a bit irresponsible. Well, no, make them look incredibly irresponsible, and they're trying to be taken a bit seriously, even if they have, quite frankly, stupid catchphrases like "Make Europe great again" or whatever, which people would be happy to know comes almost exclusively from his friendship with Donald Trump. Like he basically stole that from Trump shamelessly, like he still steals European funding, and yeah, the whole thing is ridiculous, quite honestly. But ultimately, the impact will be quite minimal, I think, and I think you will see support for Ukraine continuing regardless of what Viktor Orban wants for his best friend Vladimir Putin.
And that's the key, right? Is that we like we like to see Orban as a kind of Putinite creature, but ultimately he does wear a couple more hats than that, right? He also governs Hungary and has a set of priorities in that regard, and as president of the council, he will have European stuff that he actually wants to get done. So he can't, it can't be just all take. He can't just frustrate the politics of Europe, even to the extent that it is within his power to do so, because then he'll simply lose the cooperation of the other 26 and he won't get anything he actually wants out of his presidency, right?
Yeah, and let's also remember, and I saw that David Bailey has a question, so maybe we go to him after I answer this part. But there's an important factor to understand is that Hungary is out of allies within the EU now. I mean, previously with the whole Article 7 shenanigans that dragged on forever, they were protected by the fact that you had to have pretty much every member state at the European Council vote in favor of Article 7 sanctions towards a member state that was acting out of pocket. And what's happened now is that since Poland have become more pro-European in government, and you've got the PIS who fell out of government and were defeated by Donald Tusk, Hungary cannot keep playing the same silly games it was before. And we saw recently that Hungary was deprived of funding for, I think, a month or two or something, because of the fact that it was behaving in a poor manner. And it was behaving in a way that was in contravention with European values and all this kind of thing. So there's a lot of consequences should Hungary and Viktor Orban decide to continue being disruptive. And this will weigh on his mind. And on top of that, if he wants to genuinely be taken seriously and get things done, he cannot keep playing silly buggers. He cannot still keep playing the fool, and he can't keep playing Putin's patsy, basically.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Julia. Okay, we've got a couple of hands. David Bailey, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully the sound's okay, and hopefully I don't get cut off in the middle of the question. But thanks very much for joining us, Julia. It's fantastic that you're here, and really, I think we're all made up that you're joining us. The question I've got is this: that there's we kind of we lack a certain level of strategic leadership, but also we lack a certain level of ideology. And don't get me wrong here, I'm as anti-ideology as there can possibly be. Nevertheless, there are core values which are key to Europe, which are at the heart and which are universal. But we seem incapable of making that argument. Part of it is historical, part of it is because the European Union is only 50 years old or so, and the United States itself is not that much older. But I mean, if I look across the political landscape, you've got kind of this, you've still got this kind of socialist tendency, clockwork method of government that doesn't work, but it's still kind of a valid way of moving forward. Then you've got free market, liberal economics, which is recently been kind of let's say discredited because of the financial crisis. If you're a young person looking for a political philosophy, you're going to struggle to find it, and that's one of the reasons I think that people end up falling into the trap of conspiracy theories and ultra left or ultra right wing philosophy. What would you say to that? I mean, we see people like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Roderick Kiesewetter in Germany, who do seem to have a clear handle on where the emphasis should be in terms of philosophy. But from European Union in general, from politicians in general, it's like we're struggling to put together a core agenda of what's important about being European, what's important about being the United States even, and what's important about being part of the global alliance of, let's say, open societies. The only thing that I've found on the horizon here is Benjamin Tallis's neo-idealism as a kind of way forward. What would you say? Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, I have thousands of comments on that. That would keep us here for 2 weeks, I think. But I mean, I think that's a really great question, David, because I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, even though right now I'm very big on politics. This is my life, my passion, my career. I was very much when I was younger. I wasn't taught anything about this, and I'm lucky that I had parents who gave me, two French parents who gave me the education on Republican values and what it means to be a good citizen and what it means to be a good person. That kind of drove me to the point that I was spending my free time reading up on politics on Wikipedia and this kind of thing, rather than paying attention in class. Don't tell my teachers. But I think the important thing to do is that we need to, first of all, there are two things that we need to teach young people in school that would help us enormously. This would be civics, so explain to them how governments work, how politics functions, what political ideologies are, and how to go about, navigating this in a positive way. Because this is the important thing. It has to be positive. And I'll get to that in a second as to why. But the second thing is to teach people critical thinking, because people struggle to really put together a coherent sense of views or a coherent way of thinking that isn't simply, this sounds good to me, or I really like this person, or I really like this idea, which means that anything connected to it is perfectly correct. We need to get people out of that sense of thinking. And for example, so why I say this is because when I was younger, I mean, I have no shame saying this. I grew up in a really rough area. I grew up in Croydon, lots of gangs, lots of problems, lots of poverty, everything. People were disenchanted. And I was, because I was really into video games as a kid, I used to browse a website called 4chan. And as people who have been onto 4chan know, that is where a lot of the current groupings of people who are very pro-Trump, very pro-Putin, very hard right, very borderline to the extreme of the far right, basically developed because there was lots of really fascist tendencies. There was a lot of really violent things on the political discussions on that board, which leaked into everything else. And this had an impact in the way a lot of young people grew up thinking of politics. So, we're being robbed, the governments are against us, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric actually developed on there too. And this actually played out quite effectively during the French presidential election in 2017. Because out of curiosity, I went there and they were actually over there coordinating to help make Marine Le Pen win because they thought that she was the closest thing to what they saw on there, effectively. And this leads to young people who don't have a better education. And we see this on other forums like Something Awful or various forums on the website, and now on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and TikTok. You see a lot of young people being radicalized because they don't know any better. When you're young, you're emotional, you have emotional reactions to things, you're not necessarily taught how to handle all of this, and obviously the hormones play absolute havoc. And if you don't have something counterbalancing that toxic information you're receiving, there is a very good chance that you're going to flip and become more extreme in the way you think. And that almost happened to me, And I had a small education when it came to, Republican values and everything, which effectively kept me away from this kind of thinking. But this is really one of the key battles, I think, for the next, let's say, 30 or 40 years. We need to spend several decades making sure that education is as robust and effective and is the core pillar of our societies, because this is effectively what gets us out of the current bind where you have a lot of, for example, the Brexiteer lunatics like Nadine Dorries, who should not be anywhere near politics, in power in the UK. This is where you end up with people like Donald Trump, and this is where you end up with a lot of people like Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella coming through because they basically ran very good social media campaigns, and otherwise they're quite empty. I think David had a follow-up question, Tim?
Yep, thank you for that, Julian. I'll go back to David, and then we'll go to Bulgaria.
Yeah, just very quickly, totally agree. My concern here is that education takes generations to work. I think maybe I'm dooming here a little bit, but we're a little bit close to the edge here, and there are things that I think need to happen much faster than educating the next generation. Although that's obviously a key part and a core part of what needs to be done. Anyway, thank you.
No, you're very welcome, and I agree. But I don't think it's positive to, well, it's very clearly not positive to be more doomy because, to be honest, it's understandable, but it almost limits how you view how you can go about things. For me, I think that the most important thing is to keep trying to be as positive as you can, is to keep trying to be as impactful as you can, to keep engaged. And if you think there is a gap in education, then what you can do is you can share things like the Mriya Report or, my own publication, the French Dispatch, or whoever else is doing things when it comes to educating people on politics and what's happening, and just keep sharing these things and keep pushing them and keep driving them forward, because this is really how we actually go forward and keep influencing people. Because what we're losing out on right now as a society, whether you're from the right or the left or whatever, is that we're not effective enough in driving forward people who are trying to educate people or help people to understand the world. And this is something that the extremes and the far right are doing very well. This has basically been the entirety of Jordan Bardella's campaign in France, for example, which I'm guessing I'm going to switch to next, Tim. And this is something that is problematic. And we need to work on this, and we need to keep pushing this as a society, and we need to keep fighting for this in general.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have a question from Bull Terrier, and then we'll move on with what French politics doing. Bull Terrier.
Yeah, hi Tim and Jenny and Julian. Yeah, really interesting discussion. I just wanted to make a point that critical thinking is actually in the UK school curriculum and very much in the International Baccalaureate, the IB curriculum. It probably could be more effective, but my assessment as an educator is that there's a huge lack of this in the USA, and it's to do with the way that the education systems are devolved to the States. But that was just a comment, really. My question, going back to the discussion about Orban, is why do we think that Orban is going to see Putin after talking to Zelensky? Because he must know that Ukraine is not going to agree to a ceasefire, and particularly that he's just spoken to Zelensky about it. So why is Orban going to see Putin? Is it for domestic market, or is it a message to the EU or the USA, or what?
I think it's several things, and thank you for the question and the comment, Bulterio, because to be honest, I mean, look, I left the education system in the UK, graduating university when I was, I think, well, back in 2015 or something. So to be honest, it may have been added since, and I hope it has been. And if it has been, then I hope it works well, quite honestly. But when it comes to the Putin situation, the simple answer to that is that probably all of the above. He wants to show off how powerful he is at the European level. He wants to show off that he's a big influencer within his domestic market. He wants to show off that he's still part of this sort of authoritarian axis within the global geopolitical arena, because that also makes him look like a better ally to people like Donald Trump, who is looking likely to win the next elections, and also helps him to maintain his relationship with people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Because ultimately, Orban's presidency or his prime ministership in Hungary has been about building an alternative way of doing things in Europe and basically taking the fight to the liberal aspects of the European Union's political sphere. And so doing a lot of this basically allows him to keep his position up. And we saw recently that even though it failed, he came quite close to forming another group in the European Parliament that would have been basically controlled by himself. And while it's failed, he's now looking to basically recreate the Identity and Democracy group into something that he's now calling the Patriots, which, as you can imagine, is going to have a very un-European aspect around it, and that's going to be mostly focused around the Europe of nations concept that people like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Marine Le Pen like, because it means a weaker European Union and weaker regulations at the member state level. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with you actually. Just one quick follow-up question. The Slovakian government seems to be making a lot of pro-Russian statements, but on the other side, they're still supporting Ukraine and sending money, and that's really interesting to me. I don't know what you have to say about that.
So that is a very interesting question. This is one of those things that is very... Slovakia is a very interesting country purely because of the fact that they are very close to Russia. And I think a lot of this is mostly down to Robert Fico and his own personal political positions. But I think if I'm not wrong, what actually flipped recently was that when there was the assassination attempt on him, pardon me, it was actually done by pro-Russian militias within Slovakia. And it seems that he has, and I mean, okay, if there's new information on this, I may not have the most up-to-date information, but the attack was apparently done by a pro-Russian militia member. And that may have actually flipped the position in Slovakia, because I think since then they have made a few more pro-Ukrainian positions. And to be honest, a lot of it may also be down to the fact that they don't feel as safe when it comes to their position within the EU. And they've realized that there can be a lot more, let's say, aggressive actions against Slovakia because of the fact that they don't really help, or they're not really operating as a good ally to the rest of the member states. But I mean, to be honest, it's a member state I don't focus on entirely that much. And it's something that I would probably need to do a lot more in-depth reading to understand the dynamics and the ideologies behind it, honestly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to you both. Okay, so Julien, let us pivot to France then. Gosh, I won't pretend to understand the two-round election thing. So why don't you take us through it?
Okay, so guys, as you can imagine, this is probably my favorite topic at the moment because, yeah. But effectively what happens in French politics is that we operate a two-round system where you have a first-round vote where as many candidates as you want can just be there. They can all run, they can all engage in the political process, and we do love us some democracy in France. And after that point, normally the members, the people running for office who reach a certain threshold, and I want to say it's something around 30%, but I can't quite remember, quite honestly, off the top of my head, but they go through to a second round runoff vote, where the electorate in every circumscription or at the, let's say, the presidential elections, they can then vote for the preferred candidate. Now, this gets very interesting in politics, in France at least, because what happens then is what's happening now. You have what we call the cordon sanitaire or the Front Républicain, where everybody says, look, we don't want the far right to come into power. We don't want the descendants of Vichy France to come into power. We don't want Le Pen to come into power because this forms an existential danger to the French Republic. And so what ends up happening is that you end up having a lot more tactical voting, which right now, I think we had something around 230 candidates stand down and call to support another person running in the second round election because it would prevent the RN from coming first in an election. Now, a lot of people would say that it's undemocratic. Those people, more often than not, just want the RN to win. But in reality, it's really a case of how strongly the French feel about this party. So again, you have to think of the dynamics that leads people voting for the RN. It's a lot of the same things that we see in the far right: anti-establishment, pro-Russian sentiment, disillusionment, some conspiratorial thinking, what have you. But what's happening now is we're in a situation where in 3 or 4 days, I want to say 3 days, no, in 2 days, we may have the first majority of the far right in France, which comes with a whole host of problems in general. But the Front Républicain seems to be working. So,
Okay, so the next round is on Sunday, I understand.
yes.
And what are we expecting?
So, quite honestly, I'm telling everybody, expect the unexpected, which is the least sexy thing you can say to a television presenter trying to ask you questions, but I'm not out here trying to be sexy, I'm out here trying to look smart, which I'm probably failing at the same time too. But what we're looking at is the polls are varied across the board. I mean, we're seeing polling that shows just about everything at this stage. So currently, what I've seen is I've seen polls where the RN are winning as many as 250 seats, and I'm seeing polls where they're winning as little as 190. Now, there's two things to bear in mind when we're looking at polls. Firstly, the majority in the French parliament needs to be held by, I believe, 281 seats in the Assemblée Nationale. And if they fall short of that, but they're still the biggest party of the parliament, then, 289 seats. But if they are still the largest party, even if they don't have an absolute majority, then they have a relative majority and they have to start negotiating with various people. This becomes difficult for the RN, purely because very few people actually want to work with them. Some of you following me on Twitter may have seen the absolutely insane situation where the president of the Les Républicains, so the center-right party or the hard-right party, basically unilaterally decided that he was going to ally with his friends in the Marine Le Pen's party. And when people said, no, we're not going to do that, are you out of your mind? He kicked everybody out of the headquarters of the party and locked himself in the office for 2 days. And then you had several legal challenges to kick him out, which all went in very weird directions. You had a legal case where Les Républicains had 3 lawyers all fighting each other, and the prosecutor was absolutely baffled and just told everybody to get the fuck out of the courtroom because what are you people doing? And now we have a situation where the party is split in half because part of them have actually gone to the RN and another bunch have basically stayed with Les Républicains. But ultimately, the most positive poll that I've seen so far, and this is something that you need to bear with a bucket of salt, is that the RN will not have a majority. And they will be in a minority if everybody else gets their shit together. Now, the most positive poll that I've seen is that the RN could win between 190 to 220 seats. You could have the Nouveau Front Populaire, which is the whole wing of the left uniting to beat the far right, which could have between 159 and 183 seats. Sorry. You could have Ensemble, the liberals in France, having between 110 and 135 seats, and Les Républicains with between 30 to 50 seats. Then you have various configurations across the board. But this is important because you're going to start seeing more and more that people are, like me, are sharing lots of polls saying, look, there's all these various configurations, there's all these things. And ultimately, we're going to have two potential outcomes. One, the RN is the largest party, and they have an absolute majority, and they have control of the parliament, and they have control of the French government, and they basically take over for a couple of years. Secondly, they are the biggest party, but they don't have a majority, and then you're going to see absolute carnage in the Assemblée Nationale, where we may not even have a government, we may not have a prime minister, we may have the left, the center, and the far right all shooting each other, which will be a sight to see, and we may find ourselves having yet another election in about a year. Because there's a fun thing. Even if we can't have a government in France, even if we don't have a prime minister, despite the fact that the president doesn't have the powers of the prime minister's office in France, what would end up happening is you would basically have no government for a year, and the constitution only allows for a follow-up election after exactly 1 year after the last election. So the next election would be able to be had, at least the first round, I believe, on the 7th of July. Actually, let me check, because it would be on the 13th of July in 2025. So we would then have 1 year and 4 days of people trying to figure out what the hell is going on, stumbling around. Probably Jean-Luc Mélenchon trying to scream at some poor person in his party. You may have the Nouveau Front Populaire splitting in various configurations. You may have Renaissance, Emmanuel Macron's party, balkanizing in several directions because you've already got Darmanin trying to form a party with Edouard Philippe. You may have the Rassemblement National splitting up into several groups as well, because some people are too extreme for others and some people aren't extreme enough for others. You're going to see Les Républicains having a great time not being the focus of anybody's hatred or problematic thoughts for a couple of months. Ultimately, what I'm telling people to expect is a whole hell of carnage and a lot of messy politics. But I mean, maybe people have more specific questions on this, because it is French politics is complex and it's something that we need to work at to understand, which is why we're all here, to be honest.
Okie dokie. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. What happens if you can't form a government? So thank you for asking that. Thank you for answering that one. Okay, so conceivable impacts for Ukraine here in various scenarios. What are your thoughts, Julien?
So this is where it gets interesting. So okay, again, we have two situations. But one is the RN takes power, and they actually wait. First of all, I'll explain the répartition de pouvoir in France. So effectively, foreign affairs and security is usually the purview of the president, whereas the domestic politics falls into the hands of the government. So what we've already heard now is Marine Le Pen has straight up said she will not allow soldiers from France to be in Ukraine, and she's really very clearly a pro-Russian candidate, 100%. And because Jordan Bardella, the potential prime minister if she wins the election, is basically her puppet, he is going to do this, I think. But he has to have a majority, and there is going to be a whole lot of litigation and legal actions between the Élysée and the Assemblée Nationale in that sense. However, if the Assemblée Nationale is all broken up and no one really knows what's going on, we don't have a government, we don't have a parliament, blah, blah, blah. Well, we'll have a parliament, but we won't have a prime minister, sorry. then it's going to get very interesting because you have to look at the way the parties break down. So, for example, the Nouveau Front Populaire, you may find that the not necessarily anti-Ukraine or pro-Putin, but just about La France Insoumise, will potentially be in the majority. They may be in the minority. And every other party in that coalition is pro-Ukraine, is pro-NATO, etc. In this situation where we don't have a government, or we have some kind of loose coalition of whatever, and LFI and the RN are kept out of power, then we'll see support for Ukraine continuing. You'll see continued support from Macron's position that we should, at some point, get ready to have soldiers in Ukraine ourselves. And you're going to have a lot of this kind of situation here where you're going to see a lot of back and forth and people making things work. Of course, what may end up happening is you may see, even if the RN comes into power, you may see the European Union and the various bodies basically negotiating with the French government to get them to actually provide support to Ukraine by bribing them on certain things. Like, for example, the RN wants to stop funding the European Union. That's it. They may say, okay, we may give you some rebates on this if you agree to fund part of our support for Ukraine. They may go for that, they may not. The RN may actually trade up to get people to support, to get their people to support Ukraine if they get stronger immigration controls in the EU and a stronger Frontex, for example. But it all comes down to basically who's in power and what the litigation that will come after the elections and when Macron starts trying to do stuff in cohabitation, if that's the case. Because ultimately, a lot of what we're trying to understand here is based entirely on what we've seen in the past. So cohabitation, so having a president and a government from different groups, happens very rarely. It's only happened 3 times in French history so far, and one time you had the right and the left, right in the government and the left in parliament, if I remember correctly. And there they basically agreed, look, you handle foreign affairs, we handle domestic things, just stay out of our way. And that worked. But we've never had a directly conflictual and conspiratorial party who has controlled the Assemblée Nationale and who has then started pushing the president's buttons. So it's very complicated, as you can imagine. And it's something that, while we can hypothesize, I very much caution people from taking any hypotheses too seriously because, quite simply, we do not know what's going to happen. And going back to the education question that we had with Bull Terrier and I believe it was David Bailey earlier, we need to understand our own limits when it comes to what's happening in reality. And this forms part of the whole critical thinking and the civic education. We as experts need to also be able to tell people that these are the options, but there may also be things that we haven't foreseen yet. And these are going to take us into places that we don't know and that we don't necessarily understand. And I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. I mean, I've kind of got a constitutional follow-up question, right? This is a parliamentary election. I understood that foreign policy was under the president's purview. So, how much influence, realistically, are Le Pen's party, should they win, going to have over French foreign policy?
So this is the big question because it's one of those things that is very much how to put this. So basically, again, this comes down to the fact that historically the president handles foreign policy, but I believe legally and constitutionally, the Assemblée Nationale can call on the Constitutional Council to say, hey, who's in charge here? And what they can do is, I believe the Assemblée Nationale can put forward laws that would limit what the president of France can actually do. And this is something that's very much a complicated and complex topic because we don't know how they're going to go. I mean, there is a good argument that it is the president and they'll just say, look, you guys stay in your lane, let the president do his thing and stop being annoying. But to be honest, we've already seen in the past that basically some parties in France basically they basically push and push and push and push constantly on the Constitutional Council, and almost attempt to wear them down until they actually agree with the position being sought. So it's a very complex thing, but currently the understanding is that everything on foreign affairs and security is in the powers of the president. And I believe personally that the Constitutional Council will say that is the case. But again, we don't know what arguments would be made in favor of it being taken away from the president and being put in the hands of the parliament. But ultimately, again, this is why the Fifth Republic was constructed in this way, because de Gaulle didn't like having his hands tied back in the day, and so he created a republic that gave the president power, effectively.
Okay, thank you very much. So kind of something of an open question then. That's very interesting. Okay, let's go to Voltaria, please, who has his hand up.
Yeah, I just have a quick question for you, Tim. If the far right in France wins the majority, will you finally change your car? Maybe a Volkswagen, for example? They're very reliable, I hear.
Well, luckily I've got options because I have two cars. I've got a Berlingo and a Mazda, so I can just lean more on the Mazda.
Oh yeah, Mazda, lovely choice. Well done.
Oh, that's very silly. Okie dokie. So, Julien, I don't know how long we've got you for, but I don't want to trespass too much on your time. So, if you do need to disappear, please do just let us know. In the meantime, Jenny, did you have any questions?
No. I'm just enjoying the conversation so that I can learn more. And thank you, because I have learned tons so far. The French system seems very complicated and intricate, to say the least. Not sure if I fully understand it, so I'm not even going to ask questions yet.
Okay.
Sorry, Tim.
No
Sorry,
problem.
Tim, you're not getting a break.
I I have a question. I mean, we've talked a lot about the European Union, and we've talked a lot about France. I mean, a was one of Daniel Hannan's old adages that no government is ever sorry, no party is ever Eurosceptic when it's actually in office. How worried are we about Marine Le Pen's lot vis-a-vis the European Union? Simply because it's kind of, I mean, the European Union and France, a Venn diagram of that is not quite a circle, but it's not a circle either, right? It seems to be that there's a lot, there's a very extensive and kind of intricate degree of integration between France and the EU, and one wonders exactly how much impact an election cycle could actually have on that, especially given the divisions of statecraft between the president's office and the government. So, what's the European impact of a Le Pen victory going to be? Is she all she's cracked up to be when it comes to, going to war with Brussels?
So both yes and no. And I mean, I could stay for another half an hour, so don't worry. And thank you to Jenny, and I believe also thank you to Annette, who tweeted something at me about being happy about learning a lot on French elections. You guys are more than happy to come and help you guys out. This is what I try to do with my life. I want you guys to understand what's happening around us better. So if you guys tell me when you want me back on, I'll come back. But to the question, the ultimate thing here is that I think a lot of Eurosceptics felt very, let's say, they felt very brave until someone actually tried to leave the European Union. And then they saw just what a catastrophic mess it became when the UK enacted Brexit, because quite frankly, it was a mess. And I think most countries are basically now of the opinion that, okay, Brexit's not a good idea, but we need to try to transform the European Union into something that we like. Now, if in 5 years the far right all won in every member state, and they took power of the council, the parliament, and everything, blah, 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 then we would see a very big risk here. When it comes to one or two member states who lean far right and maybe lean a bit more Eurosceptic, then I think the worst you can expect is probably gridlock and some very, very difficult negotiations, because ultimately you need a majority at the European level to do any major changes. And I think if Marine Le Pen tried to take the EU out of, tried to take France out of the EU, or the EU out of France, you never know what she's up to. But if she tried to take France out of the EU, then not only would you see mass riots in the streets, but I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of mechanisms to take her out of office, or her protege out of office if he's prime minister, for example. But what you can expect is a lot of conflictual fighting, a lot of butting of heads. And to be honest, I mean, let's put this into context. I think you can see there's a poll floating around, and I cannot for the life of me remember where it is, mais bon, c'est comme ça, where I think it's something like 63% of all French people do not want a far-right prime minister, a far-right government, or far-right presidency. And I think there's maybe 20% don't know. So to be honest, a lot of people are scared about a future president, Marine Le Pen. I think that that's a bit overblown because the majority of people still don't want that, to be honest. And they're going to do well in the Assemblée Nationale. But I mean, we've already seen during this election, a lot of people voting for Marine Le Pen's party, they haven't read the programs. They haven't heard the news about, for example, some of Le Pen's candidates. One is someone who's under guardianship, who's apparently legally insane, and yet is going to be an MP. You've got another person who was in prison recently. Another one's a drug dealer. Another one's a really aggressive racist who said, "I'm not racist. One of my best friends is Spanish," which is the funniest thing I've ever heard in a French election. And you've got all of these random people. And to be honest, I don't think a lot of French citizens quite understand just how bombastically insane some of the ARN can be, because all they see is Marine Le Pen. All they see in these elections and in the ARN and in media things are people like Florian Philippot, Marine Le Pen, and Jordan Bardella. And the more you look into these parties, the more crazy they look and just unfit to govern they are. I mean, for example, look at what's happened. So Boris Johnson, sure, you had the Boris bounce in the 2019 general election in the UK, for example. But in the 4 years since then, or 5 years since then, you've basically seen all the crazies from the Conservatives who became MPs completely lose their shit. And you saw the impact of that. Like the Conservatives, for the first time in forever, their credibility or competence score in polling crashed through the floor. Like it's gone. They're not considered coherent, competent, smart people anymore, which is a big part of why the Conservative vote collapsed. Why a lot of people went for the protest vote, or maybe not the protest vote, but they went to Nigel Farage's Reform UK, because let's be honest, Nigel Farage is a lot of things, but he's not a bad politician. He's not a bad campaigner. He knows what he's doing, even if he may not enjoy being a parliamentarian. But
and
go ahead,
you
Tim.
saw the same with Jeremy Corbyn, of course, right?
Yeah.
The absolute trash that he brought into the Labour Party as parliamentary candidates, people like Claudia Webb, like it was just they became during the Corbyn years, like they were all over everything, and that had a colossal impact because these people are lunatics, right? Not a uniquely right-wing phenomenon, I think.
No, and it's something that happens across the board, because let's be honest, like this weird anti-establishment, anti-globalization, anti-EU, almost anti-logical political position isn't something that's exclusive to the far right. It's something that happens across the far left and the far right as well. It's why, for example, in France, we have so much trouble with my party in France, Renaissance, basically refusing to vote with La France Insoumise because they have a bunch of tanked lunatics who just, they like last election, they wanted to get out of NATO and the EU. It's absolutely insanity, and it's something that you just see everywhere. But yeah, so basically what happens is you're going to have a lot of these fights between everybody. You're going to have a lot of these chaotic scenarios happening. But I don't think Marine Le Pen's going to get France out of the EU, because we are, like, okay, even people on the far right see the value of the European Union, because civic education in France has made it clear to a lot of people that it's a good thing, and public sentiment is still pro-EU, which means that the far right knows that Brexit's a vote loser. And in fact, Marine Le Pen's voting score in Poland has gone up since she stopped doing the Brexit nonsense. But, I mean, that's a thing. And maybe a note for after we touch on the French topic or finish up, someone has asked if we can touch on the US elections briefly as well.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I guess my question then would be, or rather my observation then would be, so there's a victory for Le Pen. All of a sudden, all of these loonies that she presides over, they get a much higher public profile. The French electorate realizes that it's made a horrible mistake, and then it swings back the other way very quickly, right?
I mean, effectively, I mean, it may not too, to be honest. Let's keep all of the probabilities open, because ultimately politics is a fight of probabilities and understanding them. But I mean, for example, in one of the cases where Marine Le Pen has a relative majority but not an absolute majority, then you have all of the crazies floating about for a year, and then you may have another election because we may not have a government, we may not have a prime minister, you know. So it's an interesting situation, and to be honest, even if we have a government and it keeps going for 5 years, I mean, I think in 2027, Marine Le Pen crashes out completely. I mean, she will have surrounded herself with some absolutely insane people, and I think people will actually vote against her. Because there is some truth to the maxim that people are saying that they haven't tried the RN, so why not? Because again, people don't explain government action and politics to people well enough, and people don't understand what governments do for them. And this is a big problem.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a question from Bull Terrier, and then we'll pivot towards the United States, and that should take us up to the 2 hours. Bull Terrier.
Well, yeah, I wanted to pivot to the United States. Julian's comments about Marine Le Pen's party just sound like Trump and the Republican Party, except Trump is unfortunately doing well in the polls. So I question to Julian and yourself, actually, like, how much of this, MAGA support do you think is down to a lack of critical thinking in the USA?
I mean, I can start up on that, Tim, if you want. Or do you want to go first?
Okay, cool. No, please go for it. I had some observations about the British election vis-a-vis the United States, but we can start with this. Go for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, critical thinking. I mean, I believe you or David said that critical thinking is necessarily taught well in schools in the US. And I think one of the big problems that we have in the US is that politics is so polarized that I think the whole thing needs to be reset, and people need to figure out what the hell they want to do with the US system, because right now it just doesn't work. It just doesn't function. It doesn't work well. I mean, put it this way. I mean, as much as I like Biden, and as much as I'm the type of person who doesn't say, we should demonize Trump because, okay, he has shitty politics and he's a bit of an asshole, but to be honest, he's not necessarily an evil man, in my opinion, even if he surrounded himself with evil lunatics. But the reality that we have is that we have two geriatrics running for the presidency, both at around 1.6% of each other on average, meaning that you have half of the electorate who want Trump, the other half who want Biden, and then you have Robert Kennedy, who apparently has worms in his brain that impact his cognitive ability or something. and he's still polling at 9%. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm happy that we have a third candidate, but Jesus Christ, what the hell? And I mean, like, again, this is the crazy thing, is that Kennedy is technically a Democrat, right? But I'm willing to bet that half of his voters go to Trump. But it's the whole thing is crazy, because like what you should really do is you should have a system where you have multiple parties that can compete on different topics and have different priorities, like we have in the UK and France and what have you. And to be honest, like, okay, sure, if Kennedy's out of the picture, then I think Biden wins. But then on top of that, you have the issue where you have the constant question about his cognitive ability and his potential Alzheimer's or whatever. That is having a huge impact on apparently having an impact on his work. And okay, sure, in the US political system, and I say this as a huge fan of the very wet liberal dream, The West Wing, which is the best TV show ever, and you should all watch it. But you have this thing where basically, I mean, ultimately in the US system, most of the work is being done by the president's team. And you're not having a huge amount of work being done by the president himself. So firstly, okay, does the US system actually function in general? Which again is a question I put to all of you. And I would suggest people ask themselves this regularly about politics in general. But then again, have we actually created a system that actually, or have they created a system that actually represents what the people want and isn't just doing a lot of butting of heads? You know? And I'm not sure if I've necessarily answered your question, Voltaire, but to be honest, it's, that's where my thinking goes on US politics.
Thank you, Julien. I'll go back to you, Voltaire, and then we'll go to Aaron.
Well, I'd like to disagree with Julian on Trump. I think Trump is an evil man. I mean, his businesses have been found to be corrupt, and he's been fined. He's guilty of sexual assault, and he's been found guilty of falsifying business records in order to cover up an affair with a porn star. So I honestly think that Trump is a criminal and does not deserve to be president of the United States.
Oh no, but just to clarify, I agree with you on that point that he's a criminal and shouldn't be president of the United States. I agree, and I agree that he has done lots of bad things. I say that I don't think he's an evil man because I just think that my personal opinion is that he doesn't think, and he has an innate belief that he's smarter than everybody else, so he can do what he wants. And I don't think that's necessarily so much evil as much as it is sheer stupidity, in my opinion, because I do not think that he's a very necessarily intelligent man, and I think that it's very much hubris and ego more than anything, if I may be a bit mean.
Thank you very much for that, Julien and Voltaire. Let us go to Aaron, who I'm sure has a lot to say on this topic, bearing in mind, please, that we have 12 minutes left before Julien must disappear.
Thank you for that timing note, Tim. Yeah, I'm calling in from the U.S., happen to be in Boston this weekend, live in Tennessee. What I would say is that, to an extent, everyone's right. I think that ultimately what we're suffering from is a multi-pronged strategic attack on every single one of our institutions, whether that's the quality of our media, that's obviously our judicial system, our legislative system has been corrupted by really outside forces and inside forces, foreign and domestic. So I think I do believe, obviously in a country of almost 350 million people that spans a continent, there's a lot of diversity in the US, but I think on the whole, we have a pretty good capacity for critical thought. However, the inputs of information that enable critical thought have been distorted to such an effect and polarized that we are now being that ability is being used as a weapon against ourselves, right? So the people on the right that only listen to right-wing media sources are using those critical thoughts to basically justify their positions and vice versa. And ultimately, they're using that talent as a weapon, and they've done it by corrupting those baseline inputs to that critical thinking process. Just to illustrate, and I tweeted this to Tim and others a few minutes ago, just how organized and nefarious, not just at like the very top line level, whether it's New York Times, CNN, or whatever that's been corrupted. It's happening at the most basic local level possible, all the way down to the school board elections. I mean, my daughter is in 7th grade. We are literally fighting off a local election where we have 8 people that are brought in from other places, signed up by right-wing forces to basically deploy all of the kind of things we would all hate to have happen in our schools. So revisionist history, whataboutism on slavery, maybe the Civil War really wasn't about slavery. Maybe it was just about unionists attacking the South, those sorts of things, or the Holocaust wasn't so bad. Those sorts of thoughts. And then ultimately, they have a mission to strip funding from our public secular schools, which built all that critical thinking ability and built the US over the last 100+ years. They want to pull the funding and channel it into fundamentalist Christian schools. So we are just being strategically targeted on every front here to use, both our systems, our way of thinking, and our openness to tear ourselves apart from the inside. That is what's happening. It's not. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much for that, Aaron. Julien, did you have anything to add on that?
I mean, to be honest, yes, no, he's entirely right. I mean, I saw the tweet that he tagged us in earlier, and to be honest, this is something that's happening, and I think it's a weakness of the centrist and progressive sides of the political wing, because of the fact that while a lot of us get distracted by topics like, for example, well, not distracted in a negative sense, but we focus our attention on things like the situation in Israel and Palestine, the issues with the invasion of Ukraine, for example, what's happening in Asia. We can see that, and this happened in the UK, and this is potentially going to happen in France too. The right will always end up focusing on aggressively chasing down the bit when it comes to domestic things. And we've seen this in the US, and this is something that is actually, to be honest, quite scary when we look at things from outside, because we don't want to see the US become a place where you're teaching creationism or you're negating slavery and racism and all these kind of things. And because ultimately what actually grounds politics and keeps us going and keeps us here and really makes it possible for us to engage is that politics is based on reality and not just a sense of feeling that someone has randomly, And I mean, I agree with what Aaron says. There's lots of things happening where, and this is where the culture war thing is tiresome, problematic, and very annoying. Because the culture war, in every sense of the word, is about making people feel better about whatever random feeling they have at the time. Whether we're talking about the left or the right, people just want to have their feelings validated at the expense of everything else. And this is a big problem in reality. And this is where a lot of our problems come from. Which again, and I come back to this yet again, this is where the focus on proper critical thinking and proper civic education and just proper education in general is so important, and where you need constant fact checking in general. And I mean, I do this myself, even though it gets me in trouble with my political party in France. Like I've repeatedly published stories about my party doing incredibly stupid things in the French Dispatch, which I encourage everybody to subscribe to. The links are on my page, go for it. And it's quite tough to do, because a lot of the time you have to kind of balance the fact that, for example, a lot of people in the Democrats, when AOC and the Squad were coming forward, wanted to be critical of what the Squad were doing, because the fact that a lot of what they were proposing was nonsense. And for example, you had Ilham, what's her name? I cannot remember her family name, who was talking about supporting, an Ethiopian ethno-state or something. And people tried to critique her on that and took a political bazooka to the face, where they were told this isn't the time to do this. And there were some people climbing the ranks of the Democrats who were blown out of the succession process. They were not going to get a job in the Democrats anymore. You had something similar happen in the Republicans, where the moderate Republicans who tried to fight with Trump basically saw their careers get nuked from orbit because, and for example, they saw in the presidential debates, you had Trump saying that what's-his-face was the Zodiac killer. I always forget his name, Ted Cruz? But yeah, he Like, you get this thing where a lot of the time in politics, and this is a huge problem that I despise about my sector, is that ultimately, if you try to be too opinionated, you can have problems and it can damage your career. Of course, you can also take the pathway that I've taken, and you can just not give a shit and just go for it anyway. And so far, it seems to be serving me relatively well. But I mean, I'm not entirely sure if my party will exist in 4 years, so I can get away with it too.
Thank you very much for that, Julien. Okay, we've got a hand from Mary, and then we'd like to round off these couple of hours with a discussion of the British election vis-a-vis the United States. Mary, go.
Hello, Julia, and hi, Tim and Jenny. It's important, first of all, thank you for those comments. This last bit, I came late, but the last bit is so informative, and we thank you for being here, Julian. I have to, as an American, make a comment about two things you mentioned. One is Trump is verifiably psychologically unfit for anything, much less public life. In fact, he is verifiably psychologically very, very damaged. But more than that, and as much as that, he is a verifiable criminal. Anyone who has lived in New York City knows how deeply criminal he is. And this is not something we want in the White House, not because his people around him are so bad, which obviously are a reflection of him, but because he himself is also so very dangerous. His alliance with Russia is locked tight, absolutely locked tight, as long as it suits him. But I only say that, Julian, not to sound correcting, but to say some of us are very deeply familiar with him personally. I don't know him, but my friends are his neighbors, and more than that, the literature is there. So we don't want an opinion, we want verification and evidence, and it is there, I promise you. The second thing is America has verifiably lost IQ, intelligence, in some way. The general public is less literate than 46 other countries. We are, I think, number 47 in literacy. I mean, how is that even possible? But it's been going down. And if it's not going down, it's at least too low for a country this size with nuclear weapons. So I think it's important to look at those statistics. Additionally, IQ is going down. COVID took an enormous chunk out of our young people's educations, and the next generation coming up has missed a few years. So look for that in the future and the near future. And thirdly, I forgot, the military is having a hard time. Well, parts of the military have found that many Americans are simply unfit for recruitment. Think about how terrifying that is. And then, you couple that with the fact that the entire swath of the South section of America, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, this is predominantly a minority section of the country. And by that, I mean predominantly African American, Black American, who are being denied their rights to vote. Now, there's a lot of potential in this country, I agree, but it is verifiable that we have lost literacy, critical thinking, therefore, and other factors that are involved in critical thinking. Oh, and one more thing. The right wing here has been inculcated by a very, very organized Christo-fascist movement. It is, Julian, I beg you to take a look at a couple of things about that, because it is the driving force. It's not just political. And I agree with you. We have a problem. So all of your points are so important to listen to, and I hope everyone will take a deeper look at the literacy issue. Thank you very much.
No, and thank you very much for those points, because they are important to bring up. I mean, I'll try to address everything. I've taken some notes. I'll see what I can respond to. But for example, so the Trump fitness for office. So yes, I personally agree that he is unfit for office, but we have to look at how our democracies have been structured and the way that the system functions. And unfortunately, the US system doesn't preclude someone from becoming president, even if he's behind bars, if I'm correct. And I mean, this is something that's, is something that we need to look at in general when we're looking at the development of our democracies, of our countries, and our political systems, because these are the kind of things that we didn't think about when we founded a lot of these systems, you know? And unfortunately, for example, a lot of the topics on restructuring the entire system to be a little less, to have more checks and balances, are difficult to do in a country like the United States, where you have where states' rights are so strong. For example, and this is not just a US thing. If what was happening in the US was happening in Germany, you would see exactly the same thing, because Germany has a similar structure where the Länder, so the states inside of Germany, have quite a lot of power and they can do a lot of blocking actions in general. So this is something that's quite difficult to fix. This leaves things quite difficult to fix when it comes to changing the constitution to prevent someone who is psychologically incapable or who is a criminal. How to prevent something like literacy crashing through the floor and trying to centralize education policy at the federal level, because the structure isn't there, quite honestly. And on top of that, it makes things difficult, like enforcing voting rights. If I'm not wrong, and please correct me if I am not, in states like in areas like the South, where people are being disenfranchised, because this again falls into state competences. And it's something that's very difficult to do. And I agree with you on the fact that you have a very Christian, very borderline fascist, if not directly fascist, entity within the Republicans that are trying to shape everything. They're trying to use Donald Trump as a vehicle and trying to manipulate the disenfranchisement and the displeasure that people have with the political system, because it is true. And a lot of this came through with the Tea Party guys back in the day, with a lot of the people that Sarah Palin was climbing up with, and lots of these kind of things. Which is why it's a shame that you have less politicians like John McCain, because he was one of the people who kind of held them back and had sort of an honest, truly Republican position there. But again, this comes down to the fact that that we have in the US, a very conflictual system where you have two big parties. Because I personally believe that if it was a bit more Scandinavian in the way that you had several parties there, things would be a bit easier. And this is something that honestly, I don't really have any easy comments or solutions to the situation, because to be honest, you would almost need a president from an independent party who won a smashing majority of something like 75% to be able to change the system. And right now, with the way where we are with US politics, especially when you compare it to this video of the Romney and Obama debate from 2012, we're quite far from that, and we almost need people like Trump and everybody to be gone from the political structure before we get to that point, honestly. But really, I agree with most of what you're saying, Mary, to be honest. It's just sad that there's nothing that we can really do about it right now. Actually, no, wait, that's bullshit. I'm going to shut the fuck up on that point. No, there are stuff we can do. First of all, keep engaging in politics locally. Keep engaging with proper media that actually tell the truth and isn't partisan, like the Mriya Report. Keep engaging with your local representatives, and stop listening to people like me who tell you that there's nothing you can do, because that's bullshit. Listen to people like me who tell you there are stuff you can do, and you can actually engage and do this kind of stuff. Because look, this is what we're seeing in the UK. The UK have had an 8-year period of like constant grassroots political campaigning on the pro-EU topic that has basically decimated the Conservatives and pushed them in a corner where they had to take these really extreme positions that basically kill them. So don't listen to me when I tell you that there's not much we can do. Listen to me when I tell you there is stuff you can do, and you just have to keep pushing proper education, keep pushing proper news sources, and keep pushing the right thing. Honestly, that's the best thing you can do, and that will have bigger results than we think.
Fantastic. Wise words indeed. Thank you, Julien. Okay, do you have 5 minutes for a quick discussion of British elections and American politics?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so kind of this is something that we briefly touched on earlier on before you joined us. Impact of the British election results on the UK's transatlantic relationship. Kind of difficult to call, right? Because for us, the transatlantic relationship between the UK and the US is predominantly about security. particularly military cooperation and intelligence cooperation. Now, in that regard, it's kind of difficult to work out where Britain ends and the United States begins and vice versa. So the relationship is very, very close, and it happens at a technical level that kind of sits above the day-to-day, the day-to-day ebbs and flows of politics. I think, as a general rule of thumb, Republican administrations and Republican Congresses are generally more friendly towards the United Kingdom than Democrat ones, and particularly when the Conservative Party is in power. Now, Labour and the Democrats are kind of more natural bedfellows, I suppose, and there's kind of there does tend to be a slight, a kind of a slight relaxation of very high level political relationships when there's a Labour government as opposed to a Tory one. Now, it can be complicated because a lot of it is personality driven. So, for example, Tony Blair got along very well with George W. Bush. And famously, Theresa May and Donald Trump couldn't stand each other, for instance. So there's kind of a personality-led nuance to it. Personally, I think that a Labour government will probably be good for relations with the Biden administration. However, the stuff that the UK really wants out of this relationship now is trade-based, right? And that's going to be a sticking point, I think, whoever is in charge. Now, I hope I'm not being too simplistic, but Julien, I would really value your take on this.
No, it's not simplistic. I mean, I don't think that you can have a too simplistic or too complicated position on this, because we're looking at things from different positions, and this is just how it is, I mean, firstly, on the trade thing. So, I mean, I think it's important to note that I think on trades, aside from slightly more incendiary behavior, I think ultimately the Trump presidency has been shown to have had quite a similar trade position to the Biden presidency. And you've seen this in the Inflation Reduction Act. You've seen this in a lot of the ways that they've handled some disputes at the WTO level. And you've seen how they've had some disputes with the EU in general. It's just that sometimes when it's the Democrats, it's a bit more hush-hush, and when it's the Trump, it's all over the media. But basically, what I can see happening is, so the UK will try to maintain this balance between the UK, the EU, and the US, forgetting that, quite honestly, the US kind of sees the UK as a tertiary partner that's sort of slightly secondary to the EU, even if there's a long-standing relationship there. And ultimately, what I think will likely happen is that you'll see the UK cooperating more with the EU under Labour, regardless of whether it's Biden or Trump in the White House, to have a more concretized position and to have a bit more of a leverage, because the UK found itself in a lot of trouble with the US, where they were struggling to complete a lot of these trade deals, And this is something that's always quite complicated, and it's something that's quite weird to sort of manage, because quite honestly, sometimes it's just a bit of a struggle, Sometimes you're going to struggle to actually have these kind of relationships with the governments, but in reality, I think it's going to be slightly better in general right now, whether there's Trump or not, you have a government that's seen as more competent, that is, to be honest, probably quite a bit more competent than the Tories, who are going to be a lot more prepared. And this is where you're going to have a lot of benefits where, for example, we may start seeing the UK getting involved in the Trade and Technology Council. You may see the UK speaking a lot more of the European Commission about what they're planning to do and how they can cooperate. You may see a lot more action on for example, the China topics as well, where the US will say, okay, look, we can have a better deal if you promise to follow us on sanctions on blah, blah, blah. And you'll have slightly less conflict when it comes to WTO and UN discussions on trade topics, which ultimately, in my opinion, can only be a good thing and will also benefit. I mean, it benefits everybody. Like, this is the eternal maxim, trade helps everybody. Like, if you're trading, you're benefiting. And this is something that I think the UK government under Starmer will understand. And plus, it helps that you're going to have quite a very well-qualified lawyer and an experienced lawyer like Starmer as Prime Minister of the UK, to be honest.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when it comes to trade, this is obviously a very complex and emotive topic, right?
Mm,
Um, when it comes to the UK particularly, now the UK's more important trade relationship is obviously with the European Union. And when I
mm,
say more important, like it's 3 times the size as trade with the US. Now, the I mean, the obvious strategy here would to be to build on the strengths of both, build on the strengths of both relationships for the UK. So the strength of the relationship with the US is more about investment than it is about trade, right?
yeah.
So the UK is the largest foreign investor in the United States, and the United States is the largest foreign investor in the UK, right? So there is a colossally close investment relationship between the two. When it comes to the EU, the relationship is mostly about commonality of regulations and standards and technical cooperation and sharing the burden of multinational projects. So it seems to me that if a more kind of technocratic, slightly less ideologically driven government from this perspective did emerge from Keir Starmer's administration, then they could pursue the low hanging fruit of both relationships as they see fit, and actually
Mm.
find themselves in a really really strong position vis-a-vis both partners, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. And to be honest, I think the UK is going to have a good time with it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not a socialist, but I mean, Keir Starmer knows what he's doing. And the current cohort of Labour leaders are genuinely smart people. They come from a variety of backgrounds, so they understand what's happening across the country, you know. And like you say, this is everything they're going to do. All of the relationships they're going to build are going to be positive. I mean, even with Trump, I mean, Trump could kind of get away with some of the shenanigans in Europe purely because, you know, you had Macron helping him out and trying to be friends with him. You had the Tories who were doing God knows what he said and just like following blindly. Trump is going to come into like a slightly more solidified European continent, and he's going to have to be a bit more smart, or his team are going to have to be a bit more smart, you know? So it's even if it's Trump, even if it's Biden, to be honest, I think the trade relationship will be positive. I think the technocratic relationship between the various actors will be positive, just like it was before, even with the Trump presidency. Sorry, Theresa May hated the guy, but her advisors worked well with his advisors. You know, but ultimately, yeah, we're looking at some positive stuff. Like, I think right now we have cause for positivity. I think we have cause for being optimistic. And to be honest, despite the noise around the Biden, debate gaffe, which may have been either his mental faculty shutting down, a very bad cold, or his advisors prepping him with far too much data and statistics, I think we're in a good place. I think we got a good chance for optimistic hope, and I don't think things are looking as bad as many thought, in my opinion.
Absolutely, thank you, Julien. And what I would say on the trade front with the UK and the US is that a lot of the things that the US is concerned about tends to come from larger actors in global trade than the UK. So the US cares about cares about dumping, right? The US cares a lot about dumping, and
Yeah.
that's not something that the UK is capable of doing, particularly because the UK is not a large producer or exporter of kind of generic low value stuff that you can dump. And so I think if cooler heads prevail in both London and Washington, I think there probably is something to be done there. It's not going to be the all singing, all dancing, kind of trade and cooperation agreement style free trade thing that Brussels, that Eurocrats dream about at night. But something could be done on both tariffs and quotas with the UK and the US that would be enormously beneficial to both parties, on top of any agreement we can come to vis-a-vis investment, which is obviously the great prize between the UK and the US. So yeah, I totally agree. I think there's something to do. I think it needn't conflict with the with Britain's relationship with the European Union, because that's something that is A, both very unhelpful, and something that B, the Conservative Party, when they were in government, particularly the Boris Johnson tendency, tended to emphasize, right? It's like this kind of either or, right? It's either Europe or America, and we can't do both. And these things are kind of diametrically opposed interests. I think that's fundamentally the wrong framing. I think it's deeply unhelpful framing, and I think now that that particular water has gone under the bridge, I think we could see a return to much more sober geopolitics on this stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, again, this is going to be, so we may have a slightly rocky road when it comes to Trump and his shenanigans, but I don't think it's going to have as damaging an impact on European and US trade, especially not US and UK trade. But I mean, who knows? What may end up happening is it may push the UK to become closer to the EU, which is also possible. But I mean, I agree with most of what you said, Tim, honestly.
Fantastic. Okay, so Julien, I don't want to trespass on your time, so I beg you please to take one final question from Bull Terrier, and then we'll let you go.
Go for it.
Yeah, hi. And I was interested that Julian says, with US politics, we have cause for possibility. Now, Trump is saying some very worrying things about Ukraine, but he apparently eats McDonald's every day. So it's possible he could drop dead of a heart attack at any moment. So we can only hope.
I mean, I'm not necessarily going to comment on the health of the man because I think he's unhealthy as it is, even without all the McDonald's. But I mean, we also have to see what the results are for the other elections in the US. So the president can be kept in check by the House and the Senate, if I'm not wrong. But I haven't checked the polling for those races, and I've been focusing mostly on the presidency. So we'd have to see what exactly would happen. But we've seen it in the past where in the midterm elections, Trump ended up finding himself getting locked up and beaten back a bit, So we'd have to see how that works out. But I mean, Trump can say what he wants on the trail, but doing things in reality can be a bit more difficult.
Fantastic. Thank you much. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Julien, it's been an absolutely amazing experience talking to you. Thank you so much for coming up to speak to us, making the time. We broadcast 24/7, so we're always here. If you, we would love to schedule another segment with you. If and when there've been political developments, you can comment on. In the meantime, we're an open forum. So if you want to pop up and have a chat, you can simply join the panel and say hi. If there are any questions, any breaking news, any commentary on any of your areas of interest, you're always very welcome just to pop up, say hello, make your comments, ask your questions, do whatever you want to do. So we're always here. So don't be a stranger.
Oh, no, and thank you guys very much. You guys have been great. Your audience has been amazing. I love you all to bits. And quite honestly, if you guys have any questions, or there's something specific, you guys know where to find me. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Substack. You can find me on probably LinkedIn, to be honest, as well. Just let me know, and I'll happily drop by to answer any questions you guys may have. But really, thank you very much for the opportunity, guys. Again, lots of love, and I appreciated the conversation we've had today. But thank you very much, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we've just been joined by Julien Hertz, who is editor of the French Dispatch, an expert on geopolitics, government affairs consultant, professional EU explainer, also has covered British politics and French politics as well. So a great honor to have him with us, and I thank him from the bottom of my heart for making the time.